record. So the topic being Tarot and organization or Tarot as organization. Both topics or both parallel dimensions. But for this, I have two kind of further branches, and I would start with the first one, which is very much towards this kind of continuing on the kind of directions of cards of organizations, but using this tarot case as a way to open it up a bit more. That's the kind of starting point. And the second one relates to tarot and meaning and what kind of openings for organization, but even to the, sense of interpretation / reality that could potentially offer. That's the second. But I will also try to make it in kind of pieces that we can talk about them and not string the pieces together, which means that I'll talk too long. But starting from this, like just a basic picture of the sort of constellation. Okay, let's start with the sort of basics that we have. First of all, this idea of a card, but we also have the idea of a deck, and then we have the idea of a spread, which is kind of what I tried to illustrate with this image. That all of these actually have interesting and quite extensive, you could say formal, you could say structural qualities, but also just like operative qualities as well. So if we take a card, let's go this one first. Now, the card in itself is interesting in that, so what's the meaning of a tarot? Like how does meaning work in tarot? And this particular question and what kind of traces one can find from there is one of my sources of interest towards it, and why I think it kind of harbors a much wider phenomena than just tarot itself. Because first of all, like the meaning of a tarot, there are some qualities or similarities with like meaning of an artwork, that there is a sense of a puzzle. But in tarot, it's even kind of stronger. It is a puzzle in a way, or like crudely we can say, but the sense of like you get it in the front and it's not informing you. It's not like a text. Like if you go to dictionary or you read description in Wikipedia, this is a sense of now you're being told the information. The card being put in front of you, even if you are to read it, quote unquote, the reading is different. It's reading of a puzzle. And that it all, like to have its nature, it kind of resists to become this sort of information. Like it kind of work in that manner. But then further, you could think like it's kind of reflected in the nature of the card. So I'll just to make it concrete, I'll like the one on the, I think it's right for you. But this, if you're seeing my cursor, it's the one where the Fool is looking upwards to the sky. Anyway, like this is the Rider-Waite Fool, influenced by Golden Dawn movements, etc. But like if we look at the kind of card itself, like, and there is this traditional story of how to read the meanings of Rider-Waite Fool, which were mostly intentional. But then the key thing is that the meanings actually are not cohering, but actually kind of spreading apart into a constellation. And I'll kind of walk through it to show how it means. So we have the Fool. There is this element of carefreeness. Like this sort of how the hand position is, like it's somebody kind of stepping lightly on the travel pathway. I'll also put up my camera because my internet is apparently unstable. So If any problems arise, just say something, because it seems fine for me, but if it's not, tell me. But yeah, so carefree style. Then also there's people go further, like the clothes are not traveling clothes, etc. But then secondly, and also packed lightly for the travel itself. But then there is this like looking up towards the sky, which is this often given as this sense of hope, that it's somebody who is optimistic or hopeful towards the travel. But then right away introduces this twist compared to many of the older cards, that he's stepping towards a cliff. So his hope, looking towards the sky, precisely makes him blind towards the potential cliff that he's stepping. But the cliff is potential. It's not like a surefire, this is what's going to happen. But the cliff is something to remember about the risk of a fool. So that's the nature of the cliff in itself. Furthermore, there is the dog, who is also happily looking upwards and jumping even upwards, and kind of uh, relating this sort of giddiness of travel, but once again, like at the very edge of the chasm. And so on. There's other elements one could go on to, but like the one thing I want to kind of underline here is like all the things kind of outlined here are not like, and when you're put in a position of now read this card, it's actually intentionally not made not to be a straightforward exercise. It's more like a gym that you have to turn around and say, like, on the other hand, on the other hand, on the other hand, and these on the other hands never completely join. And that makes it a tarot card, that keeps it as a puzzle. But furthermore, like usually the card is read against something else. Like, for example, a person, or like even the traditional tarot reading doesn't just play the fool, but it plays the fool in the context of, let's say, the future of somebody's life. This also goes to the spreads themselves, but we can go to them later. But this, that it's read against something else, well, that turns it into a filter, like quite literally so. So all these things that are more like a dual of on the other hands that never actually kind of join and cohere, then behave like a filter, because they are to be a filter towards, say, some person's life. But even that filter might be in a frame, like it's now about the future or the past of that person's situation. And this is all traditional. Nothing I've said is kind of experimental, contemporary tarot. This is all like stuff from, well, you could go hundreds of years ago. But yeah, let's not fiddle with what exact time frame the kind of tarot reading kind of evolved. But nevertheless, so, but this is interesting in itself, that like to put one word for it, I could say that contrary to the aspirations of many of forms of meaning, like concepts that want to make an object of meaning, like this is the thing, not that they succeed, but that's their aspiration, that's their work. Tarot's aspirations are actually differential, that it's a meaning that exists in difference of meanings, forming a constellation that does not collapse into a point. Therefore, it's a generator, and the generator makes it a natural filter, because then what it's filtering is almost like material that goes through this generator and affects how it's generating. Okay, that's my node number one. Any comments so far? It has to be some. I will check your comments now.
I have comments, but maybe they're more like general or structural about Tarot in the context of XORG. So I want to see what you talk about next, because maybe it's not needed to ask.
I mean, it would be interesting to already bring them because I'm kind of going there, but in order that it doesn't take too long, like just throw it in, like we can either kind of do it now or kind of put it in uh, along the later process as the things
Yeah.
probably.
Broadly, I guess I would be interested in both. How can Tarot itself be seen through the lens of XORG? Like, what is an op? What is yeah, like how do we fit Tarot in XORG? And then the other way around, right? Like, how can we take the concepts of Tarot, like the card, the deck, and the spread, and adapt our Xorgian notions to it to make it actionable in a particular way, right? Like there's many
Mm,
interesting things about the spread, assembling a narrative through a sequence, a deck as a group of elements that share or not a certain characteristics. Like there's many interesting organizing principles that could
yes,
be explored.
yeah,
So
that
yeah,
yeah,
I
go
guess
ahead.
those two sides.
Yeah, that's kind of actually that's the underlying, and that's kind of the direction I'm aiming to go towards, and but we can try to kind of process that along rather than taking too long on these comments. I want to though make this reading of like it's not the elementary nature or the elementary read of a tarot card. You could make another kind of a read of what they are, but I think it's useful for this context because it kind of points out how this tarot card is already quite Zorgian, so to speak. Like hence the underlining of the filter-like nature of it. That it's kind of behaving like a filter in a very practical sense, like in a very traditional sense, it's a filter. People don't think about it like that, but the fact that you're always placing it into a context and reading the context through it and it through the context, well, that's a filter more than an object. And so that's one quality. But then, as you mentioned, we can go more deeply into this, is that it's also a card, and that means that it's like it yeah, it can be randomized, it can be a deck, it's part of a collection, it can be placed on a pattern, and in a pattern it forms like a further constellation. Like the card itself is a constellation of meanings, but then the constellation of the spread is another constellation, which is very actually similar to our boards scenes that we have been playing, which are constellations in a similar manner as well. Like it's not an accident um, that many of the rooms we did like in the last couple of weeks are kind of like tarot spreads, like from if you look at it from that angle. It's because like there is something interesting and meaningful in that kind of scene of meaning. Like spreads are definitely scenes of meaning. um, but yeah, that direction opens a lot of possibilities in itself, like but I do think like one can take this avenue of thinking about just the card as an organization. That's something we processed, and we even talked about tarot at least one time earlier. Um, but like if you then put into that there's like inherently differential generator like more a generator than an essence, like more an engine that produces than an essential thing that is on a pedestal and is what it is. Uh, that's an interesting combination, and of course in this sense you can see it kind of like an op from the perspective of an op, like it's itself is a little operation, like a little function, uh, but the function is not uh, precise, it's more differential. It's like it gives you actually room for interpretation. It has meanings, but they are not like locked in that there are only these words and only these rules, but there still are some things and some meanings. They're just a little bit more loose. It's more like a structure made out of rubber bands, so like that stretches. Uh,
And
So
can I add?
yeah,
It also feels like these meanings that you were mentioning, which obviously are loose, but then are also highly influentiated by the context. Because as well, once you read tarots, you have this sort of spread of cards, and then there's narratives that are waved around. It's never about the single card, but then it's how the card and link to the interpretation of others. So it seems as well that yes, maybe there's an overarching meaning, but then it's also the context that then shapes uh, other meanings,
mm,
maybe.
yeah, and that's the quality where I think like we have actually kind of, I think for good reasons, but maybe not kind of without highlighting it. The spaces in Miro have become more and more like tarot, which doesn't mean that they have to become tarot, but it's rather pointing that there is resonances between these two pathways. Um, uh, now, for me, actually, the one flaw of tarot, or like personally, the one thing that kind of turns it um, almost kind of a tragic point of tarot is then for all this generation and generative capabilities, one puts this almost like I don't know, like a chain of truth. Like it's an attempt of telling what will happen. Like it's kind of trying to force out of its like potential generation of meanings to find the right meaning. It's like the game put upon tarot conventionally and traditionally is actually kind of locking all this potential into a much more limited structure. So, but by itself, if you kind of remove that, okay, if you simply remove the fact that this is not now telling about future, it's just kind of generating meanings. It opens up to a completely different range of possibilities, it, especially as a structure. Like in a way, like everything that has been said, well, first of all, you could do them with any images, but you could do them with real life spaces. You could do them with sound. You could do them really text, whatever. Um, like they're kind of agnostic to the media that they're in. Like you could frame a tarot card, like quote unquote frame and quote unquote card from a space that you're in, like a hall in a department store, for example, and that could work in itself. Um, and that could kind of provide interesting approaches. Um, uh, you could similarly, as we create this sort of layer filter uh, on our boards and put like a title upon it. Similarly, if you put say this hall in a department store, a title like imaginary floating in the air, suddenly the card is changed. Similarly, the title works like a filter to the hall, and the hall works like a filter to the title, um, and kind of starts to behave like this sort of constellationary meaning in tarot card. But that's some of the kind of early possibilities, or yeah, kind of in a way basics of tarot. But any other comments, questions? Now I'm using the waiting technique. If I manage to egg some comments from you. Um, um, but Martin, you had the comment on chat. Do you want to expand on it? I changed my strategy now. I'm kind of pulling a comment from Martin. like in terms of the sort of certainly the card is informing us, which I sort of agree. I know I drew a line in the sand, but I would say that the informing is different.
I think Martin is skipping the class.
I think he's occupied somehow. Yeah, most likely. So 2 techniques for questions didn't work. Okay, we can move forward. But yeah, of course, like in the text, I made this comparison that like if we take this kind of sense of operations and we bring it to, like, let's say even kind of almost boringly traditional organizational operations documents, etc. Like for example, a charter for a company, like, the charter, which is like, what is this company about, containing this sort of principles, values, goals, things like this. Documents such as this. Like, how does that document behave? Of course, there might be different practices of reading, like intentionally using the same term as tarot, of reading that charter. But I think overall, there is this similar pattern of, like first of all, that even though it gives these meanings, it's kind of turned into this constellation. It's also treated like a filter, that its task is kind of, if there is a situation in the company and if the charter is actually cared for, then the charter is used as a filter to, for example, evaluate a situation. Does this cohere with our charter in itself? So there are lots of like tarot-like qualities to this kind of a document, but this is also true of, like, maybe to a slightly smaller extent, but still similarly, to something like a project description. Especially when it's being made, it's kind of formalized as something like especially internally for the organization, kind of like a tarot card. Like outside, it might be informative, like this is now a document where other people can read what are we doing. So that's kind of more emphasizing the information side of it. But then internally, it might be kind of wrestled over because people want to have the words there that create this sort of a filter that kind of contains all the things that cohere with values, goals, principles that we think towards the project itself. So it's not exactly the same as reading a tarot card, but it's actually much more similar than, at least it's normally thought, because usually that's not thought at all similar to tarot card readings. But am I way off base on this argument, or can you, or what do you feel?
This sounds great. Like I can imagine this being a very productive exercise in an organization. Sort of like, oh, I have this issue, I'm gonna consult the cards, like,
Yeah.
does this align to our collective vision? And that is like explored through a game, through a ritual. Like that sounds way more fun than just like looking at a PowerPoint and, I don't know, soul drenching chart or something like that. So yeah, that sounds really interesting. Sort of like tarot as a guiding principle, or as a way to guide organization identity, I guess. I'm also curious, or maybe I'm jumping ahead, but how can the tarot be also the generating force for the organization, right? Like, maybe if I'm like jumping super ahead of myself, if I imagine a XORG card game, I can imagine that being useful at any stage of an organization's, either bringing up a new organization that does not exist and aiding in that process, or adding something to an organization that is already established. So I'm thinking, yeah, that's basically what I'm thinking, and
Yeah,
how
that's
that maps to our, yeah, sorry,
no,
yeah,
no. Go
that's
ahead.
it.
Uh,
That how that maps to our categories. Like I'm thinking, for example, if there's a bunch of cards and there's a board, and then in the board there's space for the setting and maybe the scene, maybe a scene, you could have a card that slots into different parts, right? Like the fool is different when it's an up, you act as the fool, than when it's a setting, right? The setting, we're being foolish now. And that is also very generative, very productive. So yeah, those are my
yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
with the element of chance as well, that is the most interesting to me, because obviously it's a card. So whatever, I mean, whoever is part of the organizations needs to be open enough to be able to enact those and follow as well through. Which is,
yeah. That is interesting in itself, and that's definitely a topic we should visit, like in the next steps. But because it's also like it's chance, but it's actually kind of design chance. It's more like stochastics as a word that describes something that is has a chance element, but it's not random. It's not like anything can happen, but there is actually these 5 options, and then the design question is like we want permutations, but we design all the options, and so it's really in the realm of design, even though it's not just one path. So it has this sort of stochastic quality to it. But like also to Pablo's comment, like in terms of like how to compare this to um, or how to potentially utilize this as a game inside of organization, this generated quality. There's one example that I like, which is like how OpenAI used to be work. Now it's probably corrupted away from it, but is that they have this charter. The charter is still available, and it's like one page. And uh, there was a period where every project that OpenAI was considering was kind of reflected uh, upon that charter, and then seen as like uh, which elements does it reflect or harmonize with that are in the charter, and that provided the basic valuation uh, uh, towards that project. Like if it was kind of uh, pushing 5 or 7 of them the points, then it was by basis more important for OpenAI than if it had 1 or 2 points. Now, I'm not kind of presenting that as like the ideal way of approaching it, but already like an example of this, that you're essentially having a tarot-like game, like a tarot-like presence of the charter plus a game structure of this sort of reading against the project description and the charter, and then pointing out resonating qualities to create actually operations for a company itself. It's a very tarotic game approach. But of course, if you open up from there, like that's just one case. Um, uh, an interesting case for sure, but also like not like just like opening this sort of bunch of possibilities that could come from there. And I do think like also this point that if we consider the tarot card not just as an image, and certainly not an image that is only in the style that the tarots are made, but not even any image, but really any medium, or whether it's a text or slice of real life or whatever. That also opens up a couple of things. Of course, it makes the cards themselves, cards in quotation marks, quite more flexible. But furthermore, it opens up new ways of reading and generating from them. Like, and there have been these qualities like in our earlier weeks. So say when we had the images, and we added titles to them. Like you could say we were very close in terms of composing something tarot card-like from those images, and kind of using those to make meanings. And we had this system of like, okay, now I can put like this filter layer of a title and this filter layer of a description of an element in the image, and using that to actually make it more tarot card-like in itself. So these are also pointing out that once you open it up, like from the conventions of tarot cards to a more general practice, you also open up the kind of interpretation and kind of take into account that you can create different rules or ops around the interpretation to create even further potential. So that's all. That's like one big opening in this. But then on the other side of that, you have this opening of structural possibilities, like what Linda was saying, that it's a card, and then it could be random, but it could also be arranged. It could be put in a series, like a chain, like this of course happens in tarot cards, that it's like we read first this one, and then we read this one, and then we read this one, and it's almost like a generating something that resembles a narrative from the cards themselves. Or it could be, you know, like this, maybe this one, like more in a constellation pattern. And then it has the deck quality. It's like, of course, a normal tarot deck is always the same size, has the same cards, but once again, nothing really limits that either. Like you could have, you know, 20 cards, and you could have I don't know, like hundreds of cards, or like you pick randomly an image from an image board could be your card deck in itself. And then further, the deck itself has structure. Like there are things like suites that kind of creates these extra meanings upon it. But if we relinquish that, like nothing forces us to have 4 suites that are all symmetrical. Like the idea of a suite is like an idea of having themes, but kind of dynamic themes, because the suites play against each other or kind of like create this sort of a complementary structure. So you could create suites to have themes but have different complementary structures. So and then like play of all of that, both with the kind of idea of constellation and then also with the idea of what kind of operations you can have upon it. So that's a bunch of things open. Like there's now a huge amount of possibilities on the table. Probably a poverty of riches, but nevertheless.
Pekka, on a practical level, do you think, or would you like us to explore cards as an organizing principle going forward, as a way to maybe once again start thinking of making something public, accessible, and actionable?
I think it's a possibility. Like in a way, one reason that this came to my mind is we had kind of card structures in the dungeon made out of cards. And this kind of brought to my mind that maybe one could kind of create a further illustration of these card possibilities of looking at this, which is a whole nother take on cards. But I think it's in itself, it's painting a scenario. Like it's comparable maybe to the other scenarios that we have had from kind of dungeon out of cards or whatever other directions that we have had. But like it's there on the offer, and one certainly could pursue it. But even before that, it works as an example of how this kind of approaches can be, what kind of directions one can find from this nature of potential. Because like I said, actually everything in tarot cards is kind of already very close that what we are doing, which I don't think it's an accident, that they have this sort of differentiality. They want to put themselves in a scene in a board-like manner, and then they want that to have this sort of floating, the cards are almost this sort of layer filters, and the whole reading is an operation that is generative. Like it's not a jump to use that basis from the kind of perspectives that we have developed.
Yeah, the cards are particularly interesting to me because you can play many games with cards, right? Like if we have these cards, if you look one after the other, maybe it feels more like a publication where you learn about XORG concepts. You could have a tarot session where you do this prospective exercise where you ask questions to the cards. You can have a game between two players where they're trying to maybe, I don't know, put forward their ideas using a deck each. So there's like,
yeah,
tarot could itself be a filter upon the cards.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, like in a way, like I think that's actually one of the maybe not, it's wrong to say most important, but among the important points to kind of underline here, that we have already explored the potential of the card, but it's also interesting to explore the potential of tarot, which is a certain kind of approach to what's inside the card, because that it further expands what can be done with the formal elements of the card, because it's more about the contents of the card. In addition, it has some structural points certainly, but it also kind of affects the contents and the operations of the card. So it makes it interesting because, like you said, we can have many games even out of one deck, but then if those games have this like inherently generative quality always available, that further expands what can be made out of it. Like compared to traditional playing cards, well, even though they're kind of like evolved from tarot cards, but nevertheless, those mostly work as kind of point counters, which can be used for determining winning and losing. But here it's quite different. It's like more this sort of generators. That is the main point of the tarot.
And what about like sort of like anti tarots of some sorts, in the sense that obviously tarots have predetermined figures. I was just googling, it's all like 78 or something. So there's justice, but they are already categories, right? Like what about things like that obviously doesn't encompass the whole range of human experience or something. So what's not tarot card yet that is still there's obviously death, justice. This feels as well that are quite not ancient, but quite established concepts. Whereas what would be new tarots, like
I will actually bring up towards this topic, as I'll make an image search, but I'll take the sharing off for a moment that I can do it more easily. Mostly to actually kind of turn that into practice, because this might be a good point, your question, like as a bridge to go, like how to open up that, or what happens when we open up this sort of conventional palette. Let me just pick something semi-randomly. Okay, I'll go back to sharing. So, like this is not, this is maybe my proof that it's not pre-recorded by simply picking up a search, but say if one picks, say this, like certainly not the best selection. You could and there is certainly difference in between the selections, how fertile they are or not. But nevertheless, an image. Now we don't have the justice or the fool and the magician necessarily, but if I were to say put a title on this, which is the passages and blockages of human connections. That's improvised, but nevertheless, the passages and blockages of human connections. And if it just has this title, and we don't even have the conventions of reading, but I could point out like there is like this, maybe this fence on the lower left corner is pointing out this sort of human, maybe a quality of framing, but also containment, because there is a little bit of a road work going on in the very bottom. So maybe that also contains this idea of like how something that is unfinished is often contained in itself. So the passage is blocked because something is uncontained. And then there is this, let's say, interplay between passages, like everything is kind of dominated by the roads, but then what they access are these closures, which are houses. So every window stands for a closure, and it's a constant interplay of closing something and then passing to somewhere else. But I'm picking kind of like generally, maybe not easy, but kind of general points of view. But one could say, okay, what do we do with this these flags, and that are like, is it like, maybe it's symbolic, like how maybe it's telling about how connection between people, like the two houses, have this sort of colorful, expressive quality in itself, and these flags are pointing that as a quality. Still, it's probably not yet the best tarot card ever, but mostly I'm pointing out how it's already turning tarotic, and maybe there is a better name for it than passages and blockages of human connections, but but that title starts to form already potentially an archetype, which is something else than the hermit or the fool, but mainly pointing out how close the possibility is to form new ones, essentially, if that makes sense. Festive obstruction, yes. That could be even that you could raise that to be the title of the card, and then there would become a different card from it, like or festive and formal obstruction, which is a different, or obstruction slash passage, or obstruction dash passage. Then it's a concept of something that is both an obstruction and a passage. And now we are kind of in a very archetypical land. That's something that could live along the hermit and the fool, etc. in itself. So like all of this to the point, like in relation to this typical forms and the conventional concepts that are put in the cards, I don't think we are as limited to them as many people think, and many people in tarot world think that it's almost impossible to make new good ones of new archetypes. I think that's actually a highly overrated obstacle. There is a passage.
You can always make bad ones, which is also fun, right?
Yes, also that, yeah, like it doesn't have to, you don't have to have the goal of making the best tarot card ever. It can be an experimental, or
But Peko, this is related to your methodology of turning anything into a tarot card. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, like and kind of like that. It's merely a matter of ops, like to put, or rules, if you want to think in more traditional language, of actually being able to do that, and the kind of different play practices you bring around it, it can become easier. Um, that it's a game itself to generate.
I guess that's an expression of tarot as a filter, and therefore like the affordances it provides when you frame something within it, right?
Yeah, yeah. But in this sense, like, okay, just to point out a couple of potentially interesting direction. Like, what happens to an organization that decides to, let's say, tarotify um, its basic space? Like, let's say it's a organization that has this lounge space that much of the people among it spend time. What if they turn that into tarot? Like, what if, like, just like picking this image, it picks that place? Of course, it can take images out of it, but it doesn't have to limit itself to image. It could even take how people move to be the source of meaning. And what can that contribute? That's one direction. Like, there's been many directions in the pathway we walk, and like side roads from it, but this is certainly among them. And does that lead to, like, archetypes for that organization? What if it makes a card out of its launch space and its basic document describing the organization, um, and maybe its name, and then a certain person in the organization, and then a certain role in the organization, which could be many persons. Like, for example, that they take their graphic designers and let's say, rename and them as, um, I don't know, illustrators would be a kind of fairly easy choice, but maybe something more interesting. But then they make that concept illustrator or whatever into a card. And then that meaning that comes to that archetype that is kind of built out of that becomes like a tarot card like presence in the organization, along with the other elements of the deck, unquote, quote unquote, of the lounge space and the document and whatever it is.
Yeah, and what if as well you were to design these cards, tarots, before having an organization?
Yeah, also that, yeah.
To, you put them on the deck, and then you find if actually your organization has those figures, and who could actually be these figures. So it's sort of like in an ideal plane, you
Yeah,
sort of laid out the organization and it should be through these tarots, and then you go and look into the organization and you try and identify if there's a figure that actually matches that or not. What if maybe it's more figures?
yeah. There is actually a whole nother interesting game. There is, like, you actually kind of create these archetypes of organization, maybe probably a bit playfully, but kind of that are interesting to, say, put on the table and think about and generate from. Um, uh, but then when you play one after the other, maybe in a spread, that in itself can be part of the game, you're kind of generating an organization by explaining the cards, and just like you would do in a tarot read. This is actually something that there are some nuances that Mikael was working on this at one point, this sort of organizational game, which was thinking also in cards, and there's some um, resemblance, like with this particular direction, there's some resemblance with that, but it's merely kind of, for me, pointing out how kind of viable that route is, and certainly you can make an interesting, not just an interesting game out of it, but interesting organizational generator out of it. And once again, underlining, at least for me, the argument that, well, there's kind of two tragic flaws to tarot. One is the kind of shackling it to truth, but then the second one is thinking that the meaning style or the operation of meaning that happens in tarot is somehow only in tarot, where it's actually a general operation. Like that generator, I mean, somebody could call it a tarot, but that's not really the point. The point is that it's just tapping into a potential that is already there. That is, I think, one of the reasons that we have done less with this potential than others is because we're kind of obsessed with kind of syncing our meanings and searching for the truth and what is the thing that we all agree that is a fact here. And we have put much less emphasis in our culture to how these same meanings are actually generators. It's much more about kind of pinning them down. What do they really say? What it really is, which is useful, certainly. But then it has been much less about what can it produce, what kind of an generator it is. And from these, like tarot has been kind of, in a weird way, in that position, that generator position from the beginning. And this is why it's kind of a example of a much larger phenomena, like a phenomena that is a quality of all meaning and all forms of meaning. But yeah, that would be an interesting game that could be made out of it as well. But I have maybe one kind of not conclusive, concluding or kind of final point, somehow of like gathering point out of this tarot's, and that would kind of relate to this tarot and reality, because what I just said is kind of a bridge towards that. Like if it's a general quality that is available in all forms of meaning, whether they are kind of conventionalized like words or like the wall of a building, that is still a lot of meaning, a lot of established meaning, even though it's not so conventionalized as, say, the word building has. But if all of those have this sort of quality, then it's a matter of simply coming up with the rules, to put it simply, like ways to play, to shift to the mode that is in differential meaning, like whether you're on the street or facing cards or inside a game or in a coffee room or listening music, whatever the case is. You simply need those rules to have this like access to this possibility. And having played with this, I've also done some like earlier projects were sort of touching upon this. If I think Pablo Metea, who hasn't been able to, yeah, she hasn't been able to come to the sessions, but it's still present in spirit and worthy of mention that like she was part of some of the projects where we were testing this kind of approach. But at that point, I would say less like with systematic understanding of like the possibilities. But from those experiments, I can say like it actually, once you start doing that more, it creates a very interesting quality that, which I could maybe describe with the metaphor that is quite fitting, is that it kind of creates this difference between like a normal quote unquote way of looking at things or sensing things. It starts to resemble like a surface, like you would be facing always like the surface of meaning. Whereas if you're looking at it from a generative point of view, you're rather facing a vortex, because any point you pick and start processing, it starts to change. So it's like vortex of vortices. So like if we use this image as an example, like putting the title of obstacles dash passages, well, it changes the image. Or talking about the framing, the red fences there as kind of like a symbol of how we frame something that is unfinished, well, it changes those frames. And if you're in this kind of process, you're kind of what's in front of you, so to speak, is actually behaving vortically, I think that's the word, like a vortex anyway, rather than like a wall, in a sense that it is what it is, like it's stabilized to one. So in a way, like it becomes this whole change in the style of experiencing reality, so to speak. But as is my chronic ailment, I'm once again opening all the possibilities. Look at, we can even open this one and this one, you know. But nevertheless, that's kind of like, for me, that gathers together. Like if we think where we kind of started and the kind of different directions branching from there and then coming to this, that's actually kind of like some kind of an image of this sort of potential stemming from here. Then utilizing it is mostly picking and choosing. It's certainly not like using all the potential at once. But nobody ever uses all the potential of language at once. It's all picking and choosing and limiting.
Maybe if you break a window with a dictionary, that's all of the language at once, no?
That's a good, yeah, that's a good image. So now we have a tarot card that is, it's, it could be all the language at once. That could be, and the image is actually somebody like it. You can see a window that is just broken by the fact that there is a dictionary flying off. I think it's flying outside from inside, and
So
that's
it's like
now,
anger, like, yeah, unresolved anger,
yeah,
escapism.
yeah. And then people have, at one point I made textual tarots, and they're quite interesting, like text that describes an image. It's like telling what's in the image, but you don't see the image. And the one really interesting quality came that you could create this commentary that some draw this, like some versions of the card draw this house in this manner, and some draw it in that manner. It's really easy to do in text, but it's a really interesting quality, and it came to my mind like here I could say like some cards use the shards of the window to reflect like the title of the dictionary, uh, uh, but in maybe in multiple fragments, like you can see it in multiple shards, all reflecting the title of the dictionary, and that becomes a quality potentially in the card.
One thing that seems like an interesting tension, I guess, that I'm thinking about is sort of like tarot has this tone which uses vagueness as opening up the space of interpretation, right? Whereas a lot of our definitions, they might benefit from clearness, particularly operational ones. So I'm thinking how to have a set of cards that can be both precise and vague whenever they are used in different contexts, or how is just the context of tarot enough to open up the vagueness of something that's specific, or does there need to be a change in language in how you describe something for that to be opened up?
That's a good question. I think it actually opens up this, that our definition has like a whole lot of variety. Like if I pick the dictionary, for example, now, like I know you were talking about also instructions in the sense of like, you know, how to um, build up this object or whatever. But like, but dictionary, for example, if you look at dictionary definition, it's actually kind of vague itself. But what it's like, it's saying like walk, and then it might have some short description, which is like progress by. I've even checked this up, but it's somehow using legs in steady pace, something like this. And then, but then underneath it, there are words that connect to it, and maybe like other meanings. But what you get from there is kind of like this crossroads with various things. And there, actually, maybe the job is to create the crossroads, because the language is working by referring to other words, like gathering its meaning from there. Because that's the definition of a walk, consists of other words and their arrangements. And but then, like you said, there is this quality of like an instruction manual, like it's more pathway. It's like pick up this part, place this part here. Very different than from the dictionary in terms of how it instructs things, because it has a kind of it has different goals. But then furthermore, like there is this possibility, which is kind of reflected in tarot, partially at least, is like you can define something even quite exactly, but if it's just a part of the whole, like I can talk exactly about the still have it open. I think it's here. So I in the beginning talked exactly about certain parts of this card and like the position of the hands and so on. But because different parts are told exactly, but the bridges between them remain this sort of rubber bands. Like so, even though there is some kind of exactness, the shiftability. I wouldn't say weakness. I mean, there's also weakness, but this I would call like shiftability. The shiftability of the meaning is actually that the parts are floating about and they have this sort of rubber bands between them, but their exact relation is still or never settled into stone. So in that case, you have exactness, but in fragments creating shiftiness. And that's yet another way of defining. And of course, a picture itself, which is kind of defining with a lot of detail, but in this sort of vague sense of meaning, like it's a little bit like the comparison between seeing the wall of the, I think this is a pub, this particular wall, and then the concept of a wall. So the image is often like a lot of this kind of stuff, like the wall is. Like there's a lot of detail, but the detail is not uncertain, but has this sort of uh, kind of vagueness, shiftability in how do you take it in itself. Like it's not set like you must say it this way. Like you could start to talk about the chalkiness of the wall, or like that it looks kind of traditional, or and then point out to different details to support you. And that's another type of definition again. So it's an interesting area for this as a whole. Like and I think all of these have their uses. I think the key point being like I think this, if you're looking at how is the definition serving the playability of the whole you're defining, especially the kinds of things we're looking at, including the current tarot ones, is like how is the definition serving the playability of it? Is it like are we putting an image precisely to have this lot of details one could pull up because of interest? Or are we defining these separate pieces because we want this shiftability? Or are we creating extra instructions because this part really has to go this way? And then all of those potentially together, because they might describe, one piece or one game, but all kind of serving all types of definitions, serving their purpose.
I mean, what you said about that together, that's also something that, if it's the more you add, then the more you sort of draw this path, and the more almost like not specific, but then the more details you add in as the cards unfold, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a difference, I feel, in here in as well, how much you decide to lay down, compared to maybe just one card. The more you lay down the actual, more the narrative, more than the meanings accumulate, and then there's a narrative coming up, which is more and more specific.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because and this is a quality of tarot cards. They because of this shiftability, and kind of also the nature of them being a puzzle, that it's not solved, and it's actually cannot be solved completely. It requires your input, and therefore your process, like even in the case of we talking, like in front of this image, your process, your output starts to mix up, merge with the meaning itself. Like even if there was previous meaning, or in this case, it's of course the image, but if it has had a title, but we're kind of taking a tarot card, like whatever we process kind of comes part of the meaning itself. Like the meaning changes. Which is also one of these reasons why things start to turn vortex-like. Because now that you're processing it, you're actually adding to what it is. It keeps on, what it is keeps on changing. And that's why you're in a kind of semantic vortex that, so that's a key quality in the whole,
And this addition of cards definitely puts into operation terms the filter quality, right? Like they just keep adding and adding.
Yeah.
And I think, like cards as this, like I'm just thinking of them even with a sense of transparency. Like if we were to make a XORG deck, probably there's a degree of transparency that's required, or like translucency, for stacks to happen, for things to be able to look through one another. Maybe that's something like cards could shift, whether they're being used as a filter or not. The qualities of their material qualities of it can shift. Yeah, just an idea.
And can also be a deck of decks, like I've used the word again, kind of a meta deck, which means that like it's this trove of possibilities, which might contain exact cards, like we made these cards here, but it might also contain rules of how do you make new cards, or select a deck from all these cards. It's a little bit like Magic the Gathering, which is like 1,000 over, I don't remember the exact amount, but clearly over 1,000 that is still in official play. And then you actually make a deck of 40 to 60 out of those cards. So there's all these possibilities as well. So one could make such a deck for, I think what the deck could give there, in along with the how do you play the cards, the spreads side of things, and kind of rules ops side of things as well, you can create a lot of variation out of the deck itself. So it's an interesting thought. Like it could be also playing with what Linda was saying earlier, the sort of how the process becomes the meaning of the thing itself. Is like you could play something that is first generative towards an organization, but then becomes a kind of a record of the organization as well, or at least a memento of the organization, that the cards have been played and maybe people remember or even add notes next to them, but that kind of becomes like, okay, this is the state of what the organization is. So it can kind of turn or transform into the kind of definition of the body of the organization as well. So it's an interesting dimension of play in the whole.
I like also the idea of the transparent one, so that maybe, maybe just when there's some together through the transparency, then something else is formed. So, it's card A, card B, card C, and then when they're one on top of each other, then suddenly becomes Z. Or as well, sort of material qualities in like sort of like a slippery card. Maybe just a slippery function associated to the card. But yeah.
You know what? Here's a one drafty version of what such a game could be, in a completely brainstorming way. Like if you would give cards, and some of them would be like real card-like or at least fulfilled, but also could be like ways to create cards. But then you create general playing rules, which are very much kind of similar to the rules that we have been playing around lately, which is like you can always take the perspective of the filter layer that is adding something to the card, and you can always take the perspective of an op and like think about the kind of what is the operation in the card, like the rule-like behavior, and so on, like all of these, and or the types that you actually now I want to add roles into this card, like into the operation of this card. Like put that together, you're kind of getting close to creating such a game or such a deck or a meta deck, call it whatever. But like it starts. That's one way to coagulate it into sort of a game or a game, however ever you want to call it.
Yeah, this is great. I in my ideal view of a XORG deck, probably the cards, as I said before, you can play multiple games with the cards.
Yeah.
Like as Linda said, you could use the cards to build an organization and then use the cards to ask questions to the organization, right?
Yes.
Like I have this card right here that has this like holes, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And you can sort of like assemble structures with the
Yeah.
cards.
Yeah.
So there's like a building quality to it, and then you can just use them as cards.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that I'm talking in physical terms because I'm imagining all of this being digital, but definitely the material qualities of cards allow you to build structures and then play the structures, which I think could be really powerful. Yeah, that's it.
But here's the thing, I don't think it has to be either digital or physical. It can easily be like played digitally only or mixture or only physically. Like that's precisely because the card, like one can roughly speaking say that what is called a card here is actually a frame. Which card is, like that's the power of the card, that is it's a very flexible framing tool. And also flexible in the sense that it becomes this unit that can be put in a deck and creating a spread or constellation. That's why cards have such a life force, and why there's more and more designs that, well, in board game space use cards, and many of the boards are made out of cards. But then if you look at the digital space, like much of the design is informed by the frame model of the card itself. So like having this understand, like, or this sort of approach perspective towards the card, that it can be a card, but it can one can always see it as just a frame to create the card itself. And it, like creating a card is kind of part of the ops rules of the whole thing. Like and that kind of opens it up into like there can be ways to play it in digital forms or analog forms or combinations that you have physical cards like Pablo's card on the table, and then you have like a, I don't know, mirror board or a Zoom connection, and the game is actually all of those things. But I think it would be interesting to make like at least draft, because as a game, it would be interesting as a paradigm, because it would kind of challenge the like what is a game like idea. It would challenge the kind of how enclosed a game is as a structure. Um, and like because like if we use this as kind of always available playing rules, this kind of rules of modification that we have developed, it means that the cards are always alive, and it's not just like that you can play many games with it, but you can change the game that you're playing while you're playing it. But there are kind of rules for the changing of it, which is sort of like has qualities of gnomic, but is much more kind of radically open in terms of how the game can change.
It's really, really cool. Definitely something to test, I would say.
Yeah, we could like there's always possibility of a session where we kind of set the framework that, okay, let's now draft the design of this and see what comes out of it. Like not commit further than one session, but like of course we can decide to do that. Um, but nevertheless, like having this sort of, if we follow this pathway, what comes? Like if we make it into a pathway and follow it, what comes out of that? Because it might open up interesting directions. And it's one way to precisely take this question we have been uh, working around in the last couple of weeks, which is like, okay, now we have this sort of very flexible um, operating approach uh, to organizations. Um, what kind of a form one should give it, because it's like in itself it's like too much. It's like a whole grammar, like when it opens. So you should give it to people in a more contoured form. So this could be a way to find such one. Okay, this is a cool form. How to give it?
Yeah, in terms of publishing formats, I think it's really powerful because you can start small and expand, right? Like
Yeah,
there's concept of expansions within cards. You can have like a very basic set. People could get familiar with that and then expand beyond into the more crazy ones. Like, and we could also keep on expanding the deck. Like I find it very useful. It's also like one card is small enough like to work out, and you keep slowly adding to a thing
mm.
that's bigger. Like it makes a lot of sense for me, for an organization to think in this modular way.
Yeah, and when you add to it, you might add a theme expansion. You know, like you at first it was, I don't know, 10 cards, but then there was added even up just a 5 card or whatever amount, a themed expansion, and there might be another themed expansion, and then in some game you combine this set and this expansion and this expansion
Yeah,
to make the whole deck, which is kind
and
of happens in card games already, but it's a very interesting possibility.
and we've talked about this before, like how certain things from our play sessions just like stand out and remain in our minds. That sort of like these memorable oxels that could be turned into cards, like the
Yeah,
anomaly mining
yeah,
or the liquid monarch. Like all
yeah.
of this could very well become cards. Even if you're not playing with the cards, you're playing something else completely different. You're doing a game or whatever, a
Yeah,
memorable thing comes up and you're like, ah, let's turn this into a card.
and just one pers further perspective of what's possible with this form, it could be an interesting uh, kind of radically different take on lexicons. You know, like when there is an organization this or think tank that, when they're kind of defining themselves, they can point out like how we define these concepts. Like this is our lexicon. And it's usually some kind of a document where there's concept this and that and so on. But here actually one could treat the card as like, now it's not like concept definitions. Like this came to my mind from, you pointed out the anomaly mining. But if we were to make anomaly mining, we would make it into a playable object rather than a kind of encyclopedia-like definition. And that means that the anomaly mining can be played with gems. So it still has this sort of weird quality that is similar to this sort of lexicon, but it's a very different thing in itself. Like like it's every piece is playable rather than like here's how we define the, I don't know, the DAO or whatever they define. So and it would have all the qualities already mentioned, like this expandability and expandability by themes, and they could have experimental qualities. You know, you could playfully make a completely wacky expansion to it of 5 cards. Yeah. So I think it's a much more interesting way to face this. Like, okay, if we are to give anomaly mining, well, the easiest way would be to write a definition for it, and then to make it into kind of like, it's like a definition often is almost like an encyclopedia entry for it. Like this is what we mean by it. But this opens up a different kind of way of approaching the same thing. Yeah, you're defining it more as an op, like how it operates, and then it comes to this larger game where it can play with the other parts, other cards. That sounds interesting. That's a kind of a presence, which certainly has like difference between, or difference from how other identities organizations define or come out or publish themselves. I think it's worthy of pursuing this, like taking now the tools that we have developed recently and looking at this, like, yeah. And I was kind of thinking like this is maybe a good reason to bring this tarot context, because it kind of has all this potential. So yeah, I think it opens, because there is this potential, it kind of opens up this sort of awareness, like towards this kind of possibilities. Whole lot of other possibilities as well, but it allows to pick also this sort of more contoured paths from it. So we could take this as a design challenge and come up with something that, say we have just 3, to pick a number, but the small number, 3 like cards for it, but that already creates an image of what the larger thing could be. Like, of course, the beginning could be just create 1, but like create a couple that you see also the differences. And then you're already kind of having more sense of what the sets and decks could be and how it would look and operate. So it can be made in pieces. It doesn't have to be like a long development project, which can only finish once the whole deck of 80 cards is ready. Like it might be usable even with 3 cards.
But also once you start playing, then you realize what's missing almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
You can play test it essentially, like that. Like you probably, I think it's very likely that once you create the 3, you understand much better what you can do with it. Like once you start kind of testing them out, which is unavoidable. But that's just like, it's a good thing that you can kind of take it to play testing with kind of design forms, not finalized forms, but forms that are play searching. That's a good term.
You said that last week.
Might have, yes. Like I've been trying different kind of play combinations because they are kind of interesting. Play is so wide. So if you play something, you can get this interesting, like there's this wild engine, the word play, and then it's channeled by something like search. So it's a concept engine. Also Ludic exploration, yes. But I like the play search even more. It's more punchy and kind of opens up like play search. Because
super punchy. It's like
yeah.
research, but you're also searching through play.
Yeah, now I remember when I said it, yes. Like, yeah, there was this conversation on it, yeah. But, okay. But from this, we could even set this as a interesting avenue to pursue. And if we pursue it a bit before the cabal in Finland time, maybe it gives material for what the cabal in Finland could use as framework of what to do. It doesn't have to, but it's a possibility.
Absolutely. I think it's worth dedicating at least one session.
Yeah.
For sure, and see how we feel about it.
Yeah.
My fingers are itching, so maybe I don't know, go into the Miro board and
they definitely do it. Yeah, like
sketch something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be nice to have like multiple paradigms that we develop alone in our heads and then compare as the sort of like prospection of potentials.
Yeah. And this is also good because I've been kind of visiting so the earlier project was I had like on and off was called Tarot, like tarot without the T, which was a shortening for Art of Tarot, but also a kind of catchy name, or potentially, I don't know if it is, but nevertheless, but I've been lately returning and kind of redrafting some of the parts from it because I was like, okay, there's a lot of potential here, but it's also clear that it's not potential for one form. So it would be really interesting to create this XORGian take on all those capacities that could probably help also the erotic reality, as as I sometimes think it, like and maybe we can lure Thea back in because she was on the erotic project several years ago. So, but I think this is certainly creating new directions. But just like I think there is a lot of potential in this. Like if you're starting to talk about the different relation to all the senses and the interpretation of them, it's a big ground in itself. And I think this kind of thing can be informed by that. But the fact that it's forming like push towards form rather than a large philosophical point is a really good thing. Any last words? You're about to say something. It doesn't have
I
to be
was about to
last.
say, sorry guys, I have to go.
Yes.
But yes, I think it's a great idea. I want to test this. I keep having in my mind the figure of the instigator, like almost the image of someone with a little stick going on to people and instigate them to do the wrong thing, sort of, or like I don't know why he's here, but yeah, no, there's lots of potential, and it's exciting.
Yeah, and I'm particularly happy that there is this push towards form because that is kind of like this sort of quickness of becoming something tangible, like whether that's digital or not, but tangible in the sense that it's shareable.
Totally. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Nice to see you.
I will do the ritual of first I stop sharing.
Oh yeah.
And then I'll say goodbye to the virtual potential people that exist as in the potential nature of potential that YouTube videos has, which is an interesting one because you never know who they are and when they're watching. But nevertheless, the potential goodbye for the potential people.